Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Tulley, President and Executive Writing Coach at Defend, Publish, and Lead, and welcome to episode 149, Writing Emergencies. I chose this topic because I am working on a chapter for an edited collection in my discipline on writing emergencies, and I started thinking through how we go about at Defend, Publish, and Lead considering something an emergency or not. And so part of that I wrote about in the chapter, so I'm not going to spoil that here. But I really wanted to get to this question of if you're in an emergency position or not. And I think one of the ways to start thinking through this particular question is to look at a couple of things. So for me, writing emergencies typically have these three features. One is that you have some kind of a deadline and you might not make it. Now, we might all miss deadlines. So in fact, for that very book chapter I just talked about 2 seconds ago, I'm going to be a few days late. I'm going to miss that initial deadline by a few days. To me, that's not a writing emergency, partially because the editors have been very generous and they recognize that sometimes people need a few extra days in November, and they've already said, get it to us within this window, and great. So that's not an emergency. So I have some flexibility there. What I'm talking about, though, for deadlines would be things like this. We commonly see clients come to us when they are in a real state of emergency because something is happening with a deadline. All kinds of examples exist. Things like if we have a PhD student who is about to run out of funding for their program because they are now, let's say in their 7th year, and if they don't complete their dissertation by spring, they're gone. They're out of their program. Another one might be that somebody has to have grant funding to keep their lab open. And if they don't turn in the grant and they miss the deadline to get the lab funding, their lab for all of their research and possibly all of their graduate students' research shuts down. That's an emergency. And increasingly, we've seen a ton of tenure and promotion clients. So those fortunate to have tenure track positions that are applying for a permanent stake. So having tenure, possibly getting promoted to associate rank or something like that. Those kinds of folks do come to us when they might be 6 weeks away from turning in a dossier. We've even had clients 4 days away from turning in a dossier. And those are emergencies because at least in some of these cases, people won't get tenure. If they miss that deadline, they do not get it. They will, without submitting it, you're not going to get it. So, and it seems that we should have a little bit of flexibility and, won't institutions be, understanding and, what about COVID and all these other things. But the reality is, at least in some of these emergency cases, part of the reason they came to us was because they already tried going to their institutions asking for more time, and the answer was no. So they're really faced with this idea of a deadline. So that's definitely a marker to me that there's a true writing emergency going on. Some writing has to happen, and it has to be done by a certain deadline. And for whatever reason, whoever the person is that's having the emergency either thinks they're not going to make the deadline, or in some cases, they actually have already missed it. And now they're trying to decide what to do. I will do a part 2 episode for situations like that, because that requires a whole bunch of nuance that I can't do in a 10-minute episode, and work with some other content. But a deadline is definitely one of the markers. Another thing that I think is a big marker of a writing emergency that kind of can disguise itself as something that's not an emergency would be the idea that if you're going semester after semester, you need to be writing your scholarly articles, you need to be writing your dissertation chapters, but you're too busy and those of you that are on the audio can't see me making the air quotes, but you're too busy to get some of that work done. The reality is with a lot of our scholarly projects, if we don't eventually complete them, that means either someone might scoop us, like they might find our topic and actually write about it, which, academics perpetually live in fear of. It might mean that you don't have the required number of publications for tenure, or if you're a PhD student, maybe all the people that are in your cohort are writing their dissertations and still presenting at conferences and putting out articles, but you're barely scraping by getting through, some of your dissertation writing, and you're not doing the extras, which will make you a more successful candidate on the job market. So even though, just saying you're busy semester after semester, another mark to me of a writing emergency is if you've gone past a semester and you're still struggling. anyone can have a bad semester. Anyone can have a bad, honestly, I shouldn't even say a semester. I should say 9 months to a year, even if you've got those kinds of challenges that are potentially causing you not to write. Everybody can have this. So I know, for example, we've had clients that have had a death in the family, and it takes them, 9 months not to get over that death. That's a whole separate conversation. Nobody gets over that. But to be able to have the bandwidth to be able to do some scholarship. For example, many of us are at points in our lives where we lose parents or other elderly relatives, and that might require going across country to go sell a parent's house, and you lose time flying back and forth. And if somebody is, taking care of a parent and there's elder care involved and all the travel and dealing with the medical things, sometimes in some semesters and even for periods, 9 months to a year, you can't get some stuff done. But to me, if you've gone 9 months-ish and you're still not getting anything done, it might be time to consider this a true emergency and think about some ways to address it. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how to do that in a second. So a deadline is one. Being so busy that you don't manage to get some things completed would be another. A third one would be if there's some hardcore repercussions if you don't do something. And by hardcore, I mean this is a run of the mill, not just disappointing somebody. So let's take the chapter that I'm working on, for example. If I didn't do it, I like the two people that I'm writing the chapter for, and I know I personally feel disappointed, and I would be sad that I'm disappointing them. But on the other hand, I know both of those editors, and many of us have had conversations about academic motherhood and all these other things, and sometimes you just can't do it all. I am sure that nothing bad would happen to me if I pulled my chapter. And in fact, I probably would be able to then give my space up to somebody else that really needed it. So that's not something where I feel like I'm disappointed. But other places where I might be doing it and where you might be doing it would be the example again of a PhD student. Maybe their PhD supervisor has put years into supporting the student, and the student, for whatever reason, is just not making progress, or they're not making it in a direction that's actually moving them forward. That could be something that's an indicator that there's some kind of a writing emergency going on, because eventually that relationship will sour. And so one of the things that has been a surprise to me, maybe it shouldn't be, in some of the business that we do at Defend, Publish, and Lead, is mediating between PhD supervisors and their students. Because what has happened, at least in some of those relationships, is that the two of them have worked together for a long enough time, but nothing is happening, and the writing is not moving forward. And sometimes what we do is we do a Zoom call with both parties, and we listen to both sides and interpret for the student. I think what the PhD supervisor wants you to try to do is this, and we try to explain it to them and show models. And for the supervisor, we try to capture the student's point of view and say, well, here's where the breakdown is happening. They think they understand this one method, but the way it's shown in the textbook is the way that it's differently described in the way that you do it, and they want to put this extra spin on it. So we do a little bit of interpreting both ways. And to me, that breakdown in communication could be a sign of a writing emergency. And it doesn't just have to be between student and supervisor. We see this a lot with co-authors. I know we've done some episodes on collaboration and co-authoring, and things that could potentially there are things you want to watch out for to make sure you have a productive relationship. But every once in a while, we will get two co-authors or more coming to us to do a similar thing, where they basically help us sort out who is doing what, making a timeline to get the work completed, and basically establishing some ground rules for everyone, so that way everybody knows what's the expectation. And it, in some cases, I would argue, probably saves some of those relationships, because by the time they come to us, they're usually so far into the project they can't let it go, but they're so frustrated with each other that they can't move forward, and it's a limbo. So those kind of limbo situations are a problem. So just a couple of strategies that I want to throw out there, and we'll certainly do bigger episodes on different ways to address a lot of these, but here would be a couple of quick ones. For a deadline, for an immovable deadline, like let's say you're in that scenario where you have a tenure dossier, or you have 4 days before your dissertation defense and you don't have something, or 4 days before you have to have a chapter due, or you're going to get kicked out of your program, or whatever the issue is. In those cases, obviously you don't have any time to waste. One of the ways that you can certainly get some help is by calling us. We do take emergency calls and we do that, although I don't think that's the only way that you can go. I think a lot of people turn to us because we are, certainly we do lots of proactive projects, but we also get our fair share of a writing emergency clients as well. And we are here. We can't always solve everything. And one thing I should say that we do on our end is sometimes when emergencies come to us, sometimes I can't solve them and the coaches that are with me can't solve them either. So we just had one of these a couple of days ago where there was a real crisis about somebody's methodology. And it was a problem that there's no way I could solve. I didn't even know how to use the tool that they were using, but I do have several methodologists that I know that work in other areas and coaching. And so I was able to just connect those two people. So sometimes it might not be a place like ours that can solve your problem. You might have to look in multiple locations to see if somebody can help you solve it. If you're at a university, obviously universities are sometimes the best place to solve it, but sometimes the university is the cause of the problem, so that might not be ideal either. It really just depends on the circumstance. The other thing that I would do too, if you've got one of these deadlines coming up, I think I would try to make a list with two parts to it. The first part would be what absolutely has to get done so I can pass, or so I can get out of here with a C, or whatever that minimum threshold is. Determining that minimum threshold, I think, is a really good idea, because in some cases, there's so many things you want to do. Let's say in the case of like a tenure application, but you're at the point where you've got to do the things that check the box that meet the requirements in the faculty manual, so you even have a shot. Because if you're fussing around with all the extras, you're not doing the things that if you're on the border and they have to look and say, does this dossier do XYZ that our manual says to do on page 89, and you didn't do it, then you have a problem. And I do train, for the record, I do train, I know I've said this on the podcast, but I do train faculty for tenure and promotion at my institution. And that's what we do when we get to that point. We say, you can't do everything anymore. So let's think about what are those minimum threshold tasks to get you to the deadline. And then the second part of that would be, what are the extra things if I have any leftover time? And in that second list, I would argue you want to prioritize those. So maybe there's 5 things. Like one thing you want to do is revise this one part. And maybe another thing you want to do is add in an additional piece of evidence. I think I would just decide which one of the things is going to do more for me and work through the list that way and do as many as you can. Another thing that I would argue on the case of deadlines is if you've already missed it, you're going to have to figure out what to do about repercussions, right? To see what is going to happen to me in this case. Is there anything that I can do? This certainly varies based on whatever the issue is. If you want to talk through some of those options confidentially, we do that. We do some half-hour calls where people will say, I didn't turn in my tenure dossier, or I basically, we've had this before too, where we've had students basically say they can't be at their dissertation defense and nothing has happened yet. They're calling us because they're like, I just said I couldn't be there, and that is a big crucial moment in my life. What is going to happen to me? So we kind of talk through, is there something that can be done? And certainly those cases, why don't you, if you want to call me or send some business my way to find out how to do that, I'm happy to help somebody if you know somebody that's in need like that. So that would be one of the things. The other thing that I would try to do is figure out, is there a way that you could give yourself a little bit more time on a deadline, but not too much? So in some cases, PhD students will kick the can down the road and say, well, I was able to round up an extra year of funding. Sometimes that's not really what's needed. What you really just needed was 3 more weeks or 6 weeks. And having all that extra time just allows you to have that feeling of relief and then not do anything for a while again, and then sometimes get in the scenario all over again. Some things about the disappointment. One of the things that I think has really helped that we've advised clients to do is, if you know you're about to disappoint somebody, the earlier you can tip them off, the better. Usually honesty is best. We've all had academic fails in some way. We probably all missed a deadline here or there. Even if you've done it a million times before, I think it's fair to recognize it and just say, this is what's happening. It's possible you'll get, some sympathy, you'll get an extension. You just never know. Again, I'm happy to talk through some of those scenarios with you, but usually it's better to let somebody know you're about to disappoint them than to just do it and then ask for forgiveness afterward, because at least you've laid the groundwork that it's going to happen and it won't necessarily come as a total surprise. So this gives you a couple things to think about. One last thing maybe would be, all of us are probably at the point we're in November. It's academic writing month. You probably just heard our bonus episode on that, and hopefully people have had a chance to check out our academic writing month challenge, which I promise is not a high stress, produce 500 extra words today or anything like that. It's just some basic maintenance and moves to kind of hang on to your writing during November. So check that out. I'll put it in the show, the notes in the show link. Yeah, notes in the show link. But one of the other things that I would just say could be a helpful thing to think through is how much of my writing turns into an emergency, because some people I think do kind of thrive on the fact that we push up against a deadline and we keep writing, we write up until the deadline and it's all this bluster of energy and chaos. And for some people that works for them to produce writing. So I hear a lot of bashing about that kind of approach. And honestly, if that's the way you've been getting writing done for years, I am not the person to tell you to stop doing that. But if it's something that it's really weighing on you, that every semester you end up with some kind of stress, that you're still doing conference slides 2 minutes before your presentation, you're still writing that article and it's an hour overdue to the editor that told you you really needed to get it in if it had to be in this one issue. Like once you're bumping up against all that kind of stuff, there may be some other things going on. Not just that you like the rush of adrenaline. So certainly we can help with some of that. Also, I want to put out one thing to think through might be how you want to approach writing in the upcoming year. In December, we're offering our free webinar on December writing strategies. And that's one of the things that will be in there, is just how to say, what can I do so I don't get myself in this situation again? Because the more that you can kind of reflect on how you got there while you're in it, the better. Because it's easy for us, once the problem is gone, to just say, well, that was fine. I figured it out and it's all good, because it might not all be good when you get to that scenario again. So hopefully this gave you something to think about. If you need us and you are in a writing emergency, please don't hesitate to email me at christine@defendandpublish.com. We are happy to help. We can do emergency work even with less than 24 hours. Please, contact me if you need to, or set up a free consultation using our website at Defend Publish Lead. Happy writing this week.